You don't own the ground you sleep on. You don't control the pipes, wires, roads, platforms, or systems that keep your life running. You don't decide what housing costs, what energy costs, what healthcare costs, or what credit costs. And yet every month, without exception, you owe payment. Not to a king, not to a lord in a castle, but to a system that decides access before opportunity and permission before survival. And that leads to a question most people feel but rarely articulate. At what point does an economy stop being modern and start behaving like feudalism again? This is shadow history, where money, power, and systems collide, and nothing works the way you were told it does. When people hear the word feudalism, they imagine armor, castles, kings, and peasants tied to the soil. Something distant, primitive, obsolete. A system supposedly buried by progress and replaced by modern freedom. But feudalism was never really about swords or titles. It was about control over productive assets. In medieval Europe, land wasn't just property. It was food, shelter, protection, and survival itself. If you controlled land, you controlled life. If you didn't, effort didn't matter nearly as much as access. Peasants weren't poor because they were lazy. They were constrained because they didn't own what mattered. So they entered arrangements that were stable, predictable, and deeply unequal. Labor in exchange for access. Loyalty in exchange for protection. Rent in exchange for survival. This wasn't chaos. It was order. Feudalism worked because it minimized uncertainty. Everyone knew their position. Mobility was rare. Ownership was concentrated. Stability mattered more than freedom. That's the part modern stories leave out. Feudalism didn't collapse because it was inefficient. It was disrupted because something temporarily became more powerful than land. Capital. Industrialization broke land's monopoly over survival. Factories replaced fields. Cities replaced manors. Wages replaced obligations. For the first time, people could earn income without owning the underlying asset. That was the promise of the modern economy. You didn't need land. You needed skills. You didn't need inheritance. You needed labor. You didn't need permission. You needed a job. Ownership still mattered, but it wasn't everything. And for a while, access to income was enough. That window reshaped history. The 19th and 20th centuries produced something extremely rare. A broad middle class with rising wages, expanding ownership, and real upward mobility. Homes became attainable. Savings mattered. Labor had leverage. Productivity gains translated, imperfectly but meaningfully, into better lives. And people learned the wrong lesson. They assumed this arrangement was permanent. It wasn't a stable equilibrium. It was a historical exception. Because while land lost dominance, ownership never lost power. It changed form. Factories became corporations. Property became financial instruments. Infrastructure became balance sheets. And slowly, quietly, ownership began to reconcentrate. Not through conquest, through markets. No banners, no announcements, no villains. Just incentives doing what incentives always do. By the late 20th century, the logic shifted again. Capital became mobile. Assets appreciated faster than wages. Finance outpaced production, and access to the things that defined life, housing, education, healthcare, energy became increasingly dependent on ongoing payment instead of ownership. Old obligations returned wearing modern language. Not fealty, but debt. Not servitude, but subscription. Not land tenure, but permanent rent. The words softened. The structure didn't. If there were an Olympic event for economic euphemism, modern systems would still medal. Because what replaced feudal obligation wasn't freedom. It was conditional access. You could live anywhere as long as you could pay. You could move freely as long as your credit allowed it. You could participate as long as you stayed solvent. And unlike medieval peasants, modern participants were told this was empowerment. Choice feels like freedom even when the options collapse into the same outcome. This is where the comparison gets uncomfortable. Feudalism wasn't defined by cruelty. It was defined by dependency without ownership. And dependency doesn't require castles. It only requires that the assets essential to life are owned by someone else. The medieval serf depended on land he didn't own. The modern worker depends on housing, infrastructure, platforms, and financial systems he doesn't own. Different tools, same logic. And just like feudalism, the system doesn't need to be evil to be stable. It only needs to be accepted. Most people didn't rebel against feudalism because it felt unjust. They endured it because alternatives were scarce. That's the parallel that matters. When people feel trapped today, it isn't because of laws. It's because of prices. Because leverage shifted. Because access became conditional. Not by decree, by design drift. And before asking whether this system is fair or inevitable, you have to understand how it formed. It didn't arrive overnight. It didn't announce itself. It evolved quietly. As ownership concentrated, risk moved downward and stability was prioritized over mobility. Once you see that pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. Feudalism didn't disappear. It learned how to hide. Ownership reconcentrated without declaring hierarchy. It didn't need to. Hierarchies don't return through speeches. They return through prices. The acceleration came when finance stopped supporting the real economy and started reorganizing it. Capital mobility made assets more valuable than production. Housing stopped being shelter and became a store of value. Infrastructure stopped being public necessity and became an investment vehicle. Education stopped being preparation and became leverage financed upfront and repaid over decades. With each shift, ownership moved further away from the people who depended on it. That's when the system completed its evolution. In feudal economies, wealth came from controlling land. In financialized economies, wealth comes from controlling assets that appreciate faster than labor. Same principle, different instruments. Those who own appreciating assets accumulate leverage automatically. Those who rely on wages fall behind even when they do everything right. Productivity rises. Ownership captures the gains. Labor stays mobile. Life gets expensive. The system doesn't punish effort. It just rewards ownership more. And it does this consistently. Debt fills the gap not as failure but as feature. When wages lag asset prices, credit bridges survival. Mortgages replace land tenure. Student loans replace apprenticeship. Consumer credit replaces savings. Each obligation framed as opportunity. Each payment sold as progress. But debt does something precise. It locks future labor to past prices. A medieval peasant owed labor to land he didn't own. A modern worker owes labor to obligations he already signed. Different vocabulary, same gravity. That's why mobility feels harder. Not legally blocked, economically constrained. You can move. You can change jobs. You can reinvent yourself. But the cost of restarting rises every year. Miss a payment and the system reminds you who controls access. Nothing signals freedom like needing approval to exist. Critics say this comparison goes too far. That modern life isn't feudal. That no one is chained. That opportunity still exists. Technically true. Feudalism 2.0 isn't about force. It's about dependence. The medieval serf couldn't leave because survival depended on land. The modern participant can leave but only by surrendering access. Access to housing. Access to credit. Access to healthcare. Access to stability. That's not coercion. It's conditioning. And it works because it feels normal. People don't revolt against rent increases. They rebalance budgets. They don't challenge asset inflation. They chase returns. They don't question ownership concentration. They internalize blame. This is the efficiency of modern hierarchy. It doesn't demand obedience. It incentivizes compliance. And when instability hits, inflation, bubbles, crises, the system reacts exactly as trained. Assets are protected first. Liquidity flows upward. Losses are socialized. Stability is restored temporarily by reinforcing the same structures that caused imbalance. Every intervention teaches the same lesson. Ownership is protected. Dependence is managed. This isn't moral commentary. It's structural observation. And once you see it, modern anxiety makes sense. People aren't anxious because they are weak. They are anxious because leverage moved against them. They feel productive but precarious, employed but exposed, free but dependent. They sense that effort no longer guarantees security. That security increasingly requires ownership they can't reach. That's not cultural failure. It's systemic design. Feudalism didn't end because people realized it was unfair. It ended when ownership widened enough to make dependence unnecessary. Here's the implication most people avoid. When ownership narrows, dependence doesn't need enforcement. It returns automatically, not through violence, through balance sheets. The question isn't whether this system is fair. Systems don't respond to fairness. They respond to incentives. The real question is whether stability can last when most people participate permanently but own temporarily, when they carry risk without upside, when they rent stability instead of building it. Stability without mobility turns into stagnation. And stagnation is what systems historically fear most. This isn't prediction. It's pattern recognition. Understanding Feudalism 2.0 isn't about despair. It's about clarity. Modern freedom isn't binary. It exists on a spectrum shaped by ownership, leverage, and access. The closer you are to ownership, the more resilient you become. Not because you're smarter, because the system is designed to protect you. History keeps repeating the same rule. Power doesn't disappear. It reorganizes. Economic systems don't die. They evolve, carrying old logic into new forms. Feudalism didn't end when castles fell. It ended when ownership widened. And it returned when ownership narrowed again. Different century. Same mechanism. If this perspective changed how you see the system, subscribe.